Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here today to talk about existentialism, or at least to provide a cliche that comes out of existentialism. Now, as you may know, existentialism was a body of philosophy developed in the 20th century, coming out of the work of two philosophers, Franz Brentano and Edmund Husserl. And they established this field called phenomenology. And in the framework of phenomenology, other philosophers and writers and artists and many people formed a gang which was the existentialists, mainly Jean-Paul Sartre in French and some others in German and other European countries. It was mainly a pan-European movement. Now, I don't advise you to go and get into existentialism. For instance, Sartre wrote a book called Being and Nothingness. I think it's 600 pages long. I can tell you that the essence and the takeaway of existentialism consists in nothing more than a set of 8 or 10 cliches. And for instance, hell is other people. That is a cliche from existentialism. So I found these cliches to be quite valuable and pertinent. I also have delved into phenomenology and existentialism over the years, but I would consider that to be a luxury these days and not something that would benefit your time so well. So one of the cliches of existentialism that I'm going to apply in this little talk comes from Sartre, and it goes like this. Nous sommes condamnés à la liberté. It means we are condemned to be free. So keep that little notion in mind. And now I'm going to go around the bend and pick up another topic, but bring it back to that existentialist cliche. Do you know what the Rico Act is? Well, it's a legislation, it's a name for legislation that was put on the books in the United States in 1970. RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. So you have the RICO Act of 1970, which was a federal law that provides for extended criminal penalties and civil cause of action for acts performed as part of an ongoing criminal organization. So it focuses on racketeering, which is conspiratorial crime, and it allows the leaders of a syndicate to be tried for their crimes they ordered others to do or assisted them in doing. And so that legislation at that particular time was obviously directed against the mob, which is to say organized crime in the United States. So I'm proposing that RICO, as an acronym, can be attached to Rona. So I'm talking about Rona RICO. I'm talking about a massive racketeering scheme, a crime in progress. Now let me analyze this crime just for a moment. You know how in many detective films and in many police thrillers, they show the team of cops in a room, and on the wall they have photographs and diagrams and maps, and they've joined these different figures in the organized crime scheme with strings to make connections. So I'm going to draw you a picture of that sort. In the first place, at the forefront of this diagram, and central to the diagram at the moment is the pharmaceutical racketing gang. So there is a racketeering scheme purely for financial gain underway right now. And the central instrument of that scheme consists of all the pharmaceutical companies who are producing the pricks. And so there are 5 companies, and the CEOs of all these companies are criminals in a racketeering scheme. And of course, you know the names of some of these criminals. They're very well known, some of the best known names on the planet. Others you don't know the names of. But basically that's the picture of, let's call it, the nasty point of the gun. Okay, there's a gun being pointed at you by this racketeering gang. And the first thing that you see is the intimidation and extortion coming from the pharmaceutical companies. They are the prominent instruments of Rona, Rico today. Now, of course, they don't work alone. They have many, many accomplices. In fact, some of the people that you meet on the street may be accomplices to this racketeering scheme. Your neighbor may be an accomplice to it at the lowest level of the hierarchy. The success of this racketeering scheme depends on a lot of complicity, both from those who know about the scheme and are going to profit from it in one way or another, and those who don't. So it's a complicated scheme, but at the end of the day, it's nothing but a version of the mafia, who have been unfortunately defamed by their association with Sicilians and Italians. The most powerful mafia in the world is and has always been of a different ethnicity. Anyway, when you expand the network on the wall, you see that the central instrument or weapon, which is the pharmaceutical racketeering scheme, has many accomplices, particularly in politics and among the leaders, or better said, misleaders of nations. And it also has, of course, the banking system, the central banking system, which is the dominant monster, the octopus squid of finance that has the world in its grip. So before I get back to existentialism, let me emphasize that any time in any situation where you face the Rona Rico, where it comes to your door, you encounter it on the street, in the market, you hear the propaganda and the hype supporting it coming through the media. At any moment that happens in your life, if that happens, just remind yourself that you are facing a criminal organization. You're facing Rico, a racketeering and influence scam. The biggest scam, the biggest criminal operation ever attempted on this planet. It's a crime underway, but it's not a crime completed. And it's a long way from completion, although it may not look so at moments. But let me see if I can tell you why it's a long way from success. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, of course, our benevolent handlers and the people who are really behind the ones who are behind the ones who are behind the pharmaceutical racketeering, and that would be the transhumanists and the technocrats who want to make over the world in their own image, okay? So ultimately, what is behind the racketeering that you can detect is a plan of communist takeover and enslavement of the entire world by technocrats and transhumanists. That's the whole picture. Now let's look at how they intend to accomplish this takeover. The first thing to be really clear, the first thing you need to be really clear about is that they cannot do it by force. You see, the scale of the takeover encompasses every single human being living on the planet today, plus future generations to come, people not even born yet. And so the scale of the operation exceeds the ability to enforce the operation. Now, they do enforce it, as you know, and they attempt to enforce it in as many ways as possible. For instance, you hear the threat of making the prick mandatory, see? But that's only a threat so far. And there are many other threats. In fact, there's nothing but a constant stream of threats coming from the racketeers, because that's how racketeers operate. They operate under extortion and threat. But basically, it's really good to know that the scale of their operation exceeds their capacity to enforce it. What can you infer from that? Well, they must rely on compliance. They must rely on complicity with what they're doing, unknowing or unwitting complicity, as well as direct compliance with what they are doing. Now, this is where it gets tricky, and this is where the tricks come into play. For instance, one of the tricks is to put out the message. Remember that the media, who are also the accomplices, so we have three main accomplices: politicians, the media, and the banking system. The media constantly puts out the message that yes, it is voluntary. These are just advisory guidelines of the government that you should do this, you should do that. But at the same time, they put out the message that it's not so. These are not guidelines and advisories coming from the government which you are at liberty to follow or not follow. They put out both of those messages. So they use the tactic of psychological warfare known as cognitive dissonance, and they use a lot of it. They use a shitstorm of it constantly. And that is an effective technique. Yet, it does not reach to the core of the issue of compliance. Since they know that they cannot enforce their racketeering scheme through threat, through extortion, through whatever method, you need to bear in mind that their reliance on compliance is imperative, and it rhymes, so it must be true. Their reliance on compliance is imperative to the ultimate success of their grand master scheme. The Great Reset, call it what you will, it's just communism. And if you go back and look at the roots of communism and who created the ideology of communism and when, then you'll get an idea of who is at the core of this evil program and who are the authorities behind all the other layers of authority. I call them Xenanon. Zenanon. It's the most evil cult in the world, the cult of Xenanon, and I might have something to say about that soon. But here we go into the wonderland of existentialism. If the perpetrators of Rona, Rico rely on your compliance so that you will allow them to carry out their plan, then what happens if you are not allowed to comply? What happens, I repeat, if you are not allowed to comply? You see how that trick syntax reverses the proposition? What is being drummed into the minds of the population around the world constantly is, if you comply, you will be allowed to do this and this and this. If you comply to take the prick, you will be allowed to travel. You will be allowed to make friends. You will be allowed to go to work. Over and over again, they use this syntax. Remember that syntax in language, in any language whatsoever, is the NLP driver of what is said. So when I say something to you in an English sentence, in the English language, American English, obviously, there's the content of what I say. But the syntax, which is the structure of the sentence that I pronounce, is what goes to your NLP, your neuro-linguistic programming. Your neuro-linguistic circuits actually respond like tendrils of a plant, not so much to the content of what I say, but to the way that I say it. Hence, I attempt to speak in a precise and careful manner on every occasion. I know, for instance, that I have a particular style of delivery, and you all know that as well. Now, I'm not always true and rigorous 100% with that style, but I am a good part of the time. And I assure you, my friends, that I know how the syntax that I use to construct a sentence is going to act on your NLP. Oh, yes, I do, baby. And I take responsibility for that. A true teacher, a Gnostic teacher, addresses you in the way your mind is designed to learn. And I do that for your benefit and for your enlightenment. But the evil powers also use NLP. They use it to create cognitive dissonance. They use it to twist and distort the minds of people upon whom they wish to perpetrate their crimes. So the routine mantra of NLP that you hear over and over again is, and it's a threat, if you comply and do this, you will be allowed to do that. But I'm asking you a question in a different syntax, which in fact trumps and destroys their syntax. I'm asking you, what if you are not allowed to comply? Now, of course, that begs the question. Well, what wouldn't allow you to comply? Aren't you free to comply? Well, according to Sartre, no, you're not. You are not free not to be free. It's a lovely cliche, isn't it? So you see where I'm going. Now, I'm not going to elaborate too much, but I'd like to bring it to a screeching climax. So let's see how I can do that. I'll try to do it by making two simple points. The first point is, looking at the situation in the world, there are countless millions of people who are in compliance, right? No, not exactly. It depends on whether you define it as free compliance under no threat or compliance under threat and extortion. So yes, it's obvious. The evidence is there. untold millions of people are behaving in a way that indicates that they are in compliance with the demands of the authorities. But it's not free compliance, and it's not free compliance on two counts. In the first place, many of those tads, as I call people, are acting out of fear. They have accepted the narrative of the virus. They believe in it, even though I argue that the narrative of the virus is the virus. And so they're acting out of fear, and also fear of the phantom microbe, and also fear of what the authorities will do to them if they don't comply with regulations based on the threat of the phantom microbe. So they are not operating in free compliance at all. To operate in free compliance would be like this. I say to you, I'm standing there by my 57 Chevy, and I'm saying, hey, let's drive over to Malibu and walk on the beach. And you say, great idea, and I loved it when we did it last week, but I don't feel like going right now, so have a good time. That's free non-compliance. Or if you said, yeah, I can't wait to jump into that Chevy of yours. Who doesn't like to ride around in a 57 Chevy? Red with cream highlighting, right? That's free. Free to agree is free to not agree. Free to comply is free to not comply. But if I stand there holding a Glock on you, and I say, hey, how about you come along with me to the beach at Malibu? Well, your compliance is a different issue and a different choice in that situation. It's as simple as that. You may as well imagine these compliant zombies, mask holes, as people are calling them, as having a gun at their heads. They've got a bug up the ass and a gun at their heads. They are not free to not comply. But existentialism says they are not free not to be free. So how does that proposition play out? How can you actually implement that proposition? I propose that you consider the situation today with that trick in mind, with a change of syntax. Now I repeat that your Gnostic friend, be it a man or woman, teaches you in the way your mind is designed to learn. The authorities dictate to you in the ways that your mind is designed to fail. Your mind, Rigpa, is an instrument given to you in your divine endowment as a member of the anthropos or anthropine species. And like any instrument, the mind can be used wrongly. I have, for instance, an electric jigsaw. It's a tool, like the mind. And if I use that tool wrongly, I will not only damage the tool, but I will damage what I'm working on. And the authorities count on this. They do everything they can to get you to use your mind in the wrong way. There's a specific technique in the living gnosis today, a technique for reaching your NLP. It's called inceptive syntax. There's actually a Sanskrit word in Buddhism for that exact technique. It's called bodhicitta, which is generally translated as the thought of enlightenment. I would translate it as the form of expression that induces enlightenment. So here is the inceptive syntax. Don't think you are not free to comply or not comply. Think you are not allowed to comply. Again, it begs the question, what doesn't allow you to comply? You can all answer that for yourself, but I'll conclude in the way I answer it for myself. There are three things that do not allow me to comply. One is my innate goodness as a human animal. Two is common sense. And three is divine sense. So I have a three-layer foundation on which I stand. And that foundation is the basis of the way that I face the onslaught, the attack, psychological warfare, the extortion, the intimidation of the authorities who are enforcing the Rona Rico, which is a massive racketeering game. Ask yourself the question, what doesn't allow you to comply? And whatever your psyche brings up, whatever your mind answers back to your mind, is something that you need to know clearly, something that you need to remember in order to oppose and overthrow the evil crime that is underway. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.